The structural economic patterns of the dot-com era are now manifesting in orbital commerce. History remembers the dot-com bubble as a significant financial contraction that erased trillions in market value. This historical consensus may be incomplete. The economic forces that defined the early internet era did not die in the crash. They remained latent until the recent acceleration of low Earth orbit commercialization. The glare of the terminal reflected a ghost image of Dr. Anya Sharma's face, her expression a mask of focused neutrality. On the screen, rivers of numbers flowed, representing the systemic capital outflows of the late 1990s. These were not just figures, they were the fossilized ambitions of the early internet era, a digital Cambrian explosion captured in archived SEC filings and defunct corporate prospectuses. Her query had been running for hours, a complex algorithm designed to hunt for a specific kind of economic delusion, the precise point where rational infrastructure investment became an act of pure, unadulterated faith. She isolated the data for a single transatlantic fiber-optic cable laid in 1998. The project had consumed over $2 billion, a staggering sum even for the frenetic dot-com boom. Anya cross-referenced the cable's stated terabit per second capacity against telecommunications traffic reports from the same year. The result was a chasm. The infrastructure built was capable of serving a digital civilization that did not yet exist, a digital superhighway with the traffic of a country lane. It was a monument to speculation, a bet placed on a future that was at the time little more than an era of unprecedented speculative fervor. This was the echo she had been chasing. The investment was not simply optimistic, it was disconnected from the material reality of the market. The financial world had not funded the early internet based on existing demand. It had funded the precondition for demand, sinking billions to the bottom of the ocean on the assumption that if the pathways were built, a new world would inevitably rise to fill them. They were building the foundations of a city before the blueprints for the buildings had even been drawn. Anya watched the graph render on her secondary monitor, a radical divergence of two lines. One, a near flat line representing actual data usage, the other, a near vertical spike of capital expenditure. It was a profound market anomaly, a divergence that challenged traditional economic forecasting. Here, in the cold, hard data of a financial bubble that had burst decades ago, was a principle of creation. Anya closed the financial archives of the dot-com crash. The ghost architecture of that previous boom receded, replaced by the kinetic real-time feed she licensed from Bryce Tech. Her monitor now displayed a holographic projection of Earth, a deep blue marble swaddled in a rapidly thickening net of light. Each point of light was a commercial satellite in low Earth orbit, its trajectory a delicate silver thread. She ran the simulation forward. The screen flickered as the timeline advanced, week by week, launch by launch. The net of light did not just grow, it coalesced, forming dense overlapping highways of data transmission. The Starlink constellation expanded with algorithmic precision, and the placeholders for the thousands of satellites planned for Project Kuiper blinked into existence, a spectral grid awaiting its physical form. The sheer scale was hypnotic. This was not a gradual expansion. It was a territorial rush, an infrastructural land grab in the high frontier. The pattern she had uncovered in the financial data of the early internet era was now replaying itself, not in spreadsheets, but in the physical commons of near-Earth space. She isolated the second critical variable, pulling launch cost data from the past 2 decades. A new graph appeared next to the globe, its curve a steep, dramatic plummet. The cost to deliver 1 kilogram of payload to orbit had fallen by an order of magnitude. This was the missing catalyst, the economic key that had unlocked the void. Reusable rockets were the modern equivalent of the optical amplifiers and wavelength division multiplexing that had made the 1990s fiber boom technically possible. With the two datasets correlated, the parallel became undeniable. The immense capital expenditure of the dot-com era had laid millions of miles of dark fiber, cables with vast unused capacity, on the conviction that future demand would eventually consume it. Now, the new titans of the space industry were launching thousands of satellites, creating a blanket of orbital bandwidth that dwarfed current, verifiable market needs. It was like watching roads appear before traffic exists. The logic was identical. Build the conduit first, and the commerce will follow. The new space economy was being constructed on the very same speculative foundation that had once underpinned the early internet, a high-stakes wager that history was about to repeat itself, this time on a planetary scale. The orbital map dissolved from the screen, its elegant web of light giving way to the jagged, volatile peaks of market graphs. Anya shifted her focus from the physics of orbital mechanics to the powerful, often irrational forces of human economics. She opened a series of quarterly reports from Space Capital, a leading venture firm whose entire thesis was built on the commercialization of the final frontier. The data was not a steady stream of investment, but a geyser. Billions of dollars in private equity were flooding the emergent space economy, chasing launch providers, satellite manufacturers, and data analytics firms with an almost frantic urgency. This was the fuel. The precipitous drop in launch costs had unlocked the door to space, but it was this torrent of capital that was flinging it wide open. The sentiment embedded in the analyst reports and market projections felt unnervingly familiar. It was the same manic optimism she had seen in the digitized archives of the dot-com boom, a collective belief that a new technological paradigm rendered old-world financial caution obsolete. The language was identical. Disruption, first-mover advantage, capturing $1 trillion market that did not yet exist. The capital was not just following opportunity, it was creating its own gravitational field, pulling in more and more investment, distorting valuations until they became untethered from revenue or profit. Anya knew how this story ended. A system energized by such pure speculation cannot expand forever. She cross-referenced the investment surge with the number of new companies entering the space industry. The proliferation was staggering. For every company with a defensible technological moat, there were a dozen others built on derivative ideas and speculative hype. A correction was not just a risk, it was a structural certainty. Just as the dot-com crash led to the rapid dissolution of companies that had mistaken a rising tide for inherent genius, a similar reckoning would come for the space economy. It would be a great filtering event, a rigorous but essential market mechanism to distinguish sustainable foundational platforms from the ephemeral noise. Only the most resilient, those with truly vital technology or an unassailable strategic position, would survive the inevitable prolonged market contraction. Anya leaned back, the flow of data finally stilled. On her primary screen, the two economic histories ran side by side. The explosive, speculative build-out of the early internet era and the burgeoning orbital gold rush of the new space economy. The patterns were so congruent, they suggested a recurring cycle of technological expansion. The same precipitous drop in foundational costs, the same deluge of speculative capital, the same massive overbuild of infrastructure far in advance of demand. The historical parallels are striking, reflecting consistent patterns across 25 years of technological progress. And yet, this was where the predictive power of the past reached its limit. The analogy, for all its structural elegance, was fundamentally incomplete. The undersea cables of the dot-com era were a profound achievement, but their function was singular: to move bits of information from one point on Earth's surface to another. They connected the world as it was. The infrastructure now being assembled in orbit was different in kind, not just in degree. This network was not merely a conduit, it was a platform. Its purpose was not just communication, but observation, interaction, and eventually expansion. The thousands of satellites from Starlink and the planned fleets of Project Kuiper were the first layer, but what they enabled went far beyond global broadband. They are establishing a global integrated data infrastructure capable of monitoring agricultural yields, tracking carbon emissions, and managing global logistics with a granularity never before possible. This was the first critical divergence. The second was even more profound. The new space industry was not just building infrastructure for Earth, but in space. It was the genesis of a true off-world economy. The The same launch vehicles carrying communication satellites were also carrying the prototypes for orbital factories, satellite servicing drones, and asteroid prospecting missions. This was not about making the existing world more efficient. It was about building the logistical and industrial foundation for a new one. The frantic investment, documented by firms like Space Capital, was, perhaps unwittingly, funding the scaffolding for a future that extended beyond the atmosphere. It was like seeing the foundations of a city before the buildings arrive, except this city had no geographical boundaries. Anya finalized her thesis. The coming market correction, which she viewed as inevitable, would not be an ending, but a pruning. It would strip away the unsustainable ventures, but the core infrastructure, the highways in the void, would remain, just as the dark fiber had remained after the dot-com crash. That dormant infrastructure had enabled the rise of the modern digital giants a decade later. The orbital infrastructure would do the same, but for applications that seemed like science fiction today. She was reading the first chapter of a story everyone else thinks is still a footnote. The true transformative potential of the space economy was not in replicating the past, but in creating a ledger for a future whose most valuable entries had not yet been conceived. It is easy to dismiss history as a collection of closed chapters, moments that are over and done. But as this analysis shows, sometimes the most powerful economic forces do not disappear after a crash, they simply change their arena. The dynamics of the dot-com bubble serve as more than a warning. They provide a framework for understanding the current orbital expansion and for a future that is quietly being built above our heads, one launch at a time. Uncovering these deep patterns suggests a significant market recalibration is a probable outcome of this rapid expansion. Is that kind of significant market recalibration a necessary phase for true, lasting innovation? Or is it a preventable failure that we should strive to avoid this time around? The answer lies in what happens when the digital highways of the entire planet are owned not by nations, but by a handful of private visionaries.